transition to Scott Nystrom's presentation on COVID in the long term.
Good afternoon, everybody. Fred, can you hear me? So I'm going to keep going, assuming that everybody can hear me right now. Good afternoon, everybody. I guess I get the first presentation today. I am going to share my screen now that I'm the presenter. And let's see if everybody can see it. All right. So it looks like everybody can see it, and I'll get going. So real quick, just to give some context on this presentation you're about to see, is this is a presentation that I did as a webinar. As you can see, it was in June. And what it talks about is COVID in the long term. So what are some of the long-term economic and demographic implications of the pandemic that we're currently still experiencing? Fred talked about a few of them in terms of the remote work kind of within the United States context. The context I'm going to mostly talk about is more the macro US level. So there's obviously regional implications, urban, suburban, different parts of the country and different cities and different states, but I'm going to talk more about the national level, even the global level implications out of something like this. So I'll skip ahead. If anybody wants the full longer version of this presentation, email me or contact REMI about it. They're happy to distribute it, but I'm really going to bring this down to the core messages. So one thing I wanted to note, and I'm just going to put this chart up. There's not a ton to talk about here given the topic at hand, but I think it's interesting just for its own sake. Is that one thing that I think is a likely outcome of the COVID pandemic is a world that becomes more autarkic, if we remember our trade theory or that terminology, where because of the pandemic, there's going to be lessened levels of trust between different nations of the world, different trading partners, particularly between the United States and China. And as a consequence, on top of that, just that kind of geopolitical mistrust, there's also going to be more of an emphasis of nationalizing critical supply chains. This has historically been true for things like heavy industries like steel and defense related and energy, but it's probably going to be a bit more the case for other sectors of the economy going forward as well, like medicine and equipment and pharmaceuticals. And it's also probably going to be the case for some types of digital commerce, some types of services as well. We've seen recent little spats and blowups on this with the United States and China locked into a trade war, the United States renegotiating a trade deal with Canada and Mexico, stalling trade deals with other nations in the Pacific, calls for the United States to nationalize its supply of drugs and medical equipment away from Chinese sources. And if you look historically, very long term, not just to COVID or even back to the Spanish flu, but looking throughout human history, whenever there's a pandemic, one trend that always happens that Fred already talked about is de-urbanization. People spread out. So Fred talked about that. But another one is de-integration. Areas that used to trade with each other that had interconnected economies and cultures tend not to have those. And this is why I put this chart up here, is if you look at the history of the tariff in the United States, starting from the 1820s up until now, we can see that throughout most of American history, certainly throughout the 19th century, the United States was a very protectionist nation. It ebbed and flowed depending on which part of the 19th century you're talking about. Generally speaking, when Democrats were in charge, like in the 1830s and 40s, you had lower tariffs. Generally speaking, when Republicans were charged, so starting in the 1860s and running through to 1916, you generally had higher tariffs. But then there's this great historical round of trade liberalizations starting in the 1930s under Franklin Roosevelt and continuing all the way until more or less now, or at least a few years ago. This world that we've inhabited of a pretty open economy that does a lot of trade with the rest of the world, that has existed more or less only since the Second World War, it's under some threats from now. And that will have economic implications for all of us in having a more domesticized or autarkic economy going forward. Another implication of the COVID pandemic is increasing pressures on fiscal policy, particularly at the federal level. So this presentation, this chart here, I'll just leave it up, let everybody digest it for a few minutes while I'm talking over it. But this chart here is from the Congressional Budget Office, and it was produced with data from CBO from early this year, before COVID hit. It's from like January or February. So we have a nice snapshot here before COVID happens. And what this shows is just the fiscal state of the US federal government. So we have a stacked bar chart or a stacked area chart that shows federal spending as a percentage of GDP on major budget items. The two largest at the bottom, of course, are Social Security and Medicare, followed by Medicaid, which includes the subsidies under the Affordable Care Act, other income security, other mandatory spending, which is mostly federal pensions, then defense, and then other discretionary, which is mostly research, transportation, some education, and the like. And then on top of that, that gray bar is net interest. And what you can all obviously see here is how much the finances of the federal government have changed in the past few decades, starting in the 1960s when Kennedy and Johnson were president. Most of the federal government was defense. It was that orange category. Defense has made up an increasingly small amount of federal spending up till now. And what has replaced it is, as you can see, is mostly Social Security and Medicare. And that trend is going to continue into the future. Defense spending, CBO projects it staying about 3.5% of GDP, while these various social entitlement programs are going from roughly 10% of GDP to closer to 15. On top of that, as more and more debt piles up, net interest payments get higher and higher and higher. So eventually, federal spending is projected within 30 years. So if we think 30 years backwards, that was the H.W. Bush administration. That's, early life for some people on this call, maybe even before they were born, but for a lot of people on this call, that's living memory. So we're not that far away from some of these things. And what we can see here is federal revenues are about 18–19% of GDP in their projections, which is its historical average since the Second World War. And then we can see the red line, which I added, which is interest payments as a share of federal spending. And historically, interest payments as a share of federal revenues were pretty small, a couple percent of GDP, or a couple percent of the budget on the right of federal revenues. But in the 90s and 80s, it got pretty high, but that was because of high interest rates. Now that interest rates are low, what's going on is the principal on the debt is getting so high. So again, within 20–30 years, 40% of federal revenues are going to be needed to cover just net interest. So it's the standard, household finance conversation where if you have compounding debts, high interest debts, that aren't paid down, eventually the principals, doesn't matter what they were to start, compound interest eats you alive in the opposite direction. Now I say all this, and we'll remind everybody that this is from January. This is before COVID. And if we look at the data in 2010, 2011 in here, we can see what happened the last time there was a major recession. And what happened was federal spending went up very significantly, particularly on these social entitlement programs. When the economy goes sour, more people retire, so Social Security payments go up. More people have to sign up for Medicaid, so that payment goes up. And there's emergency federal spending and emergency tax cuts in the discretionary category, in the defense category, and that reduced federal revenues. All of us probably also realize that revenues, particularly income taxes, are elastic to economic performance. If the labor market's not doing well, sales and income tax revenue drops. So basically, if you look at last time there was a major disruption to the economy, there was this big spike in spending and this big dip in revenues that took a few years to recover on both sides. We essentially have that happening right now. I will be fascinated to see what this chart looks like next time CBO does a major update of this. The point I'm bringing this all together with is the federal government has served as a spender and a lender of last resort to itself, to states, to pension funds, to private companies, to individual households throughout this crisis and in previous ones. But its fiscal resources are not infinitely deep. They are very deep, but they're not infinitely deep. And we're looking at a future here where the federal government, its requirements for spending are starting to greatly outstrip its abilities to bring revenues in without significant spending cuts or tax increases. which means there'll be a more constrained fiscal environment for the federal government going forward. I don't know when exactly this is going to hit. My guesses usually revolve around the exhaustion of the Social Security Trust Fund in the late 2020s, but we'll see exactly when all this hits. And then the long-term demographic effect I wanted to talk to everybody about is this. So this is the birth rate. It's from REMI. It's from the Standard Regional Control or Standard National Control that you all have, of what the percentage of American women giving birth from age 10 to 49, the ages of which women can give birth in the model, what the percentage of women giving birth there is in any given year. And just for context, the rate of replacement is something like 2.7% here. So if you look at that dotted line across the chart, that's about the rate of replacement. And this shows the history starting in 2001 up through the Great Recession and then to where we were now before COVID hit. And what we can see is prior to the Great Recession, the fertility rate of the American families was a little above the rate of replacement. But then the recession hits and it drops very precipitously. And now we're below the rate of replacement. And what's interesting about this chart, though, is not only did it drop during the recession, it dropped essentially permanently, and the model has it projected to continue dropping going forward. This is before COVID. And as we all probably know intuitively, having children is a big life decision. It requires a lot of kind of implicit confidence in the future, both for yourself and our species as a whole. And when the recession happened, there was a lot of young adults displaced and underemployed and indebted as a consequence of this, which has held down their rate of having children. And I bet another iteration of this, where, of course, younger workers with less experience and contacts trying to come out of school, younger workers who work in sectors like transportation and hospitality and retail and food service that have been particularly hit hard by this recession, have diminished immediate and long-term prospects. Therefore, they're less likely to have children. Therefore, our fertility rate may continue to drop. This long-term future of a low fertility rate, instead of being 30, 40 years in the future, might be coming relatively soon. The main point I bring all these things up together is if you look at the kind of three factors I've mentioned, an autarkic trade network, an economy that's not as integrated in with the rest of the world, an economy that, and I didn't mention this too, but doesn't accept as much immigration, partially because there just aren't as many immigrants throughout the world available to move. World population rates have declined. And then also a low birth rate, and then a federal government that is incredibly constrained from a fiscal standpoint. What I'm really describing, just skipping ahead on a couple of these things here, is the Japanese economy. There's this one kind of quote, I forget who it was by, but there's essentially four types of economies throughout the world. There's developed, there's developing, there's Japan, and there's Argentina. And I think Japan and Argentina might be a place for all of us to look for kind of what the future economically, even politically, looks like for the United States, where again, international trade is declining, fertility rates are lower, and there's less international migration. And on top of that, in the long term, there's a constrained federal government that can't pay its debts, or at least can't do what it promised it was doing. So future taxpayers should expect higher taxes, future pensioners should expect lower benefits, and future people who'd receive debt holders, just the security holders of the government, might not get everything back that they thought they would out of it. So that was really it. There's factors that I didn't look at, which it's actually very nice that Fred kind of looked at a few of these, like the urbanization issues. So that's just something I wanted to kind of talk everybody through, is if you look at the long term, just you running one scenario here through the model of including these things that I talked about, you get a smaller population, you get a smaller economy, you get a smaller labor force in the long term. So COVID has probably greatly, if not greatly, but significantly diminished the economic prospects of this country and the world as a whole, if only because there's probably going to be fewer people who are workers 20, 30 years from now to invest, to start businesses, to work, to save, to spend, as opposed to what there would have been otherwise as a consequence of this. So that's for the most part it. There's a few kind of regional things here. This is the last slide I wanted to go through with everybody, just showing a couple different demographic trends. So on the left is the REMI standard regional control, and I've broken American population into 4 categories. So the dark blue at the bottom are children. The medium cyan blue in the middle are adolescents, college age, 18 to 24. The gray in the middle are core working age adults, 25 to 64. And then the 65 plus is the Medicaid, Social Security, or Medicare and Social Security population, retirees. And we can see on the left that right now the United States population in 2001 was a little under 300 million. It's about 330 now. And if you take the standard regional control and project it up to 2050, it's about 380 million. But if you look at the right, where there's a COVID scenario where, again, there's less migration internationally, there's less births, you'll see that the number of children declines. Instead of 75 million, you only have 57 million. And the number of adolescents declines from 31 million to about 25, and you lose about 10 million working age adults, but you still have the same number of older adults to take care of, both directly in an individual to family sense, but also indirectly through the federal government, through our social entitlement systems. So, you know, the ratio is much worse in the future because there's fewer young workers, and all these kind of compounding issues I just mentioned about fiscal stagnation of the federal government and an economy that's not growing its way out of it all come to pass at once. So that was pretty much all I wanted to talk about for everybody. I'll leave this up, just give everybody a few little conclusions and turn it back over to Fred to head into the next set of folks on our panel.
Thank you, Scott.